glad to be here, talk about some of the stuff that is coming in Spring Cloud that maybe hasn't been talked about over and over for the rest of the conference. It seems like I almost got a little self-conscious the other day when they kept mentioning Spring Cloud over and over in the keynote. But my name is Spencer Gibb. I work for Pivotal on Spring Cloud. I joined specifically to start Spring Cloud with Dave Sire. It's been a little more than a year. We announced Spring Cloud at Spring One in Dallas last year. Yeah, that's Pivotal. That's us. And it's been exciting to work on it to try and add some more features, and we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit about some of those and delve a little deeper. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. So if I don't respond, just yell, and we'll try and get your questions answered. So when we started Spring Cloud, as we were working on it, we discovered some concepts, some abstractions that we created as we started working on it. One of those is service registration and discovery. Another is distributed configuration. A control bus, which in my mind, for those of you familiar with Spring Boot and Actuator, the control bus to me is kind of like a distributed actuator. So rather than acting on an individual node at a time, you can act on multiple nodes. And then some cluster primitives that some of the other folks had come up with, like leader election and locks. So in our initial release, we've since started a release train naming. So it wasn't originally called Angel, but we kind of renamed it. So in our original release, the release train names are tube station names in London. Dave's from London, and so he picked something near and dear to his heart. We went with Netflix Eureka for our service discovery and registration. We have, let's see, we do have a Netflix employee here, John Schneider, if you want to raise your hand. So, and the collaboration has been fun with Netflix on that. For distributed configuration, they hadn't open sourced their configuration server, but we did something in a similar vein. If you've heard other talks, backed by Git or Subversion source control, we created a bus based on RabbitMQ, and we didn't have a release of the cluster implementation. So just the other day, what day is today? What, Thursday? I think it was Tuesday night. I posted a blog post to the spring.io website announcing the first milestone of Brixton, which is the next version in our release train. Some of the things that have been added to Brixton that I'll try and is the focus of the talk today, besides upgrades to the Netflix stack, the Netflix version of Spring Cloud. We're going to talk about Consul from HashiCorp. Anyone familiar with Consul? If you're not familiar with Consul, how about Vagrant? So same guys, Mitchell Hashimoto and company. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Apache Zookeeper. We'll also talk a little bit about tracing and our Spring Cloud Sleuth. Some cluster implementations, and a little bit about etcd from CoreOS, which is not in the release. It's an incubator project. So we started with Eureka for service discovery and registration. It's highly available. They built it to scale, to handle, I don't want to say the wrong number, but hundreds, if not thousands, of instances of services that are available to the Netflix team. It prefers to hand a client data even if it's stale. So it's AP in the CAP theorem. It has some long thresholds for registration and cache refreshing. So that includes Ribbon, which is the load balancing client. So sometimes it takes a minute or two before you see a new instance that has been added. And it's certainly been battle tested, right? This is one of the reasons we picked Netflix to start, because of they just pound it, and it has handled many failures and works well for Netflix. So that's where we started. But I was already on my radar before I even joined the company were some of these other technologies. And when we started the project, even if it wasn't a goal originally, in my mind, I wanted Spring Cloud to kind of behave like the Spring Data project, for example, that has support for relational databases and KeyValue stores and column stores and network data. Anyway, so I wanted it to kind of be like that. So I had started playing with some of these other technologies and looking at implementations, other implementations of registration and configuration. So I talked a little bit about our config server. It's stateless. We use the Bootstrap phase that Spring Cloud has introduced to a Spring Boot app to load configuration data from an external source, and then to start into the normal application context lifecycle of an application. So we built that in and put this Bootstrap phase into a common project, Spring Cloud Commons, so that it could be reused. We built the bus originally on Rabbit, so our only implementation worked on RabbitMQ, and that was one of the sticking points with me, is that I didn't like that it was specific to a message broker implementation. We have a couple of endpoints, actuator endpoints, that we added to be able to refresh the context of a number of instances at once, or to change the local Spring environment. So to start, who's heard of Zookeeper? I would assume a lot of people have. So it's part of the Apache Foundation. It's a consistent distributed coordination server. When you ask what Zookeeper is, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. You could say it's useful for configuration. Well, you could say it's service registration. Well, you could say you could do locks with. Well, you can do lots of these things, right? But in the end, it is something that can keep state in a clustered way. It started life as a Hadoop subproject, so out of that to try and help coordinate Hadoop clusters. So it's fairly old compared to the rest of the technologies that we're looking at. John, do you know when Eureka started?
It had been 2010, 2011.
Okay, so we've even got a few years on Eureka. And lots of companies use this for various technologies. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at Zookeeper is because of that. Lots of companies already have Zookeeper as part of their stack. In fact, Netflix uses it, not for service discovery and registration, but they have it as part of their stack. In fact, they have open sourced, they donated Curator to the Apache Foundation, which is a fabulous client library that Spring Cloud Zookeeper actually takes advantage of, as well as Exhibitor, which is a Zookeeper sidecar process that helps keep it alive and do some other things that facilitate running a Zookeeper cluster. So Zookeeper config uses the hierarchical store to store configuration. Like I said, it uses curator. There's an issue to add support for exhibitor. Exhibitor allows when the state of the Zookeeper cluster changes, it allows it to dynamically update the members of the cluster. So to be a little more highly available. So one of the things that's interesting about Spring Boot's configuration is it loads properties files in a specific order, right? There's in config server, you can have application.yaml or properties, which gets loaded by every application. Then you could have application dash some Spring profile, like application dev or application dash prod. And then you can have a specific named properties files just for a specific type of application. And Zookeeper configuration, we mimic that hierarchy even though there aren't individual files, right? In Zookeeper, you store the individual properties on their own. So we also have Zookeeper service discovery. So I had started, we used there's a recipe from Curator for discovery. Our friends at For Finance out in Poland also did something similar, and so they donated some of their work to Spring Cloud. They've been very, very interested in Spring Cloud and have done some significant contributions to Spring Cloud Zookeeper specifically, and they were excited for this release so they can start to integrate and migrate to Spring Cloud Zookeeper and eventually be running Spring Cloud Zookeeper in their production environments. There is no bus implementation. There probably could be, but when I asked my colleagues about it, they strongly suggested against writing a bus implementation in Zookeeper. So let's see it. Let's see if we can actually make this run. Close those down to make sure I don't bring my laptop just to a crawl. See that? All right. So on a Mac, it's super easy to get Zookeeper. Just brew install Zookeeper, if I recall correctly. So it started. Yay. So I can come look in the... So by default, we put configuration in the config directory. And you can see that there is a directory for an application named Test Zookeeper App. And it has some properties in it. So if I come to IntelliJ, all right, so this is the sample application that is in the Spring Cloud Zookeeper project. For those of you familiar with this is a Spring Boot application, pretty standard. All of Spring Cloud is built on top of Spring Boot. We take advantage heavily of the auto configuration and actuator and the general and the configuration properties from Spring Boot. So we really take advantage of Spring Boot. So this is a Spring Boot application. You can see I use @enable DiscoveryClient from our Commons project. And what happens is that depending on the implementation of the DiscoveryClient, in this case Zookeeper, it will auto-register the application and set it up so that you can discover other services running. And I'll just show that we have a little mapping that says I'm going to start multiple instances of myself, and it will just cycle through. I'm going to be a client of myself, just so we can see the load balancing via ribbon, actually. So one of the things that's interesting is that ribbon is a Netflix project. It's client-side load balancer. We have support for that in Spring Cloud Netflix, but ribbon, we have support. It works across all of these different implementations by plugging in a server list that is specific to this Discovery client. So this load balancer client is a ribbon load balancer. So I'm going to go ahead and, hello? So I'm going to start a couple of these. Really quick. I'm going to hit this endpoint. So I'm just returning the server that's the object that's returned from the load balancer client, and you can see that I got myself on port 8081. But if I refresh that, it's just cycling through. So both of these were registered. If I go to, that's funny. Okay, don't know why that says it's down. It's working. And so you can see that there are some services registered in with the Zookeeper Discovery Client. Also, if I look at the ENV actuator endpoint, you can see that I loaded some properties out of Zookeeper. We wanted to make sure that I decided that the hierarchy in Zookeeper would be translated into the dot notation that Spring Boot expects. So if I look in the CLI at these properties, if I get this guy, so this is the value that's in there, and you can see that this hierarchical key path translated into config/test Zookeeper app info.description. Okay? So fairly straightforward translation, and allows you to individually set those properties. One of the nice things about the Curator client, it has built-in retry similar to the Eureka client, so I could have started this and not had Zookeeper up, and the app would have happily run. It wouldn't obviously been able to connect to the other services, or other services connect to it, but as soon as Zookeeper came up, it would have connected, which is really, really nice feature of Curator. Let's see if there's anything else to show with Zookeeper. I think that's, any questions about Zookeeper before we move on to the next? Awesome. So next up is consul, like I said, from HashiCorp, creators of Vagrant. The nice things about consul is that it is, by default, it is multi-data center aware. You can be running, so consul is you run a cluster of consul servers, and there are no masters or slaves. They have the concept of a server and an agent, but the server cluster itself is masterless. Uses a peer-to-peer gossip system that HashiCorp created called Surf, which in and of itself is pretty slick. Consul leans a little more towards having consistent data, but you can actually tune it. There are 3 different ways you can tell console to retrieve data, and won't get into those, but it is tunable. The agent, the way they describe how to use it, runs as a sidecar to your application. So it's really nice because the default localhost 8500 should probably be what you're connecting to anyway. You just would run the agent right next to every instance of an application. So it's really, really nice. And they have a slick little web-based UI that I will show you. You'll get a demo of. So one of the things that Consul comes with is a KeyValue Store. And they have a very nice, so Zookeeper, you need a client library to connect to it. And with Consul, everything is available via a REST API. Very nice, very clean REST API. And so the KeyValue HTTP API is what we use to store properties. It looks very similar to Zookeeper, right? It's a hierarchy of directories and values. And again, we mimic the same order that I showed you with Zookeeper. What is different about Consul is that service registration and discovery is baked into Consul, right? It's not a recipe built on top of it. It's a first-class citizen. And there are APIs specifically for service discovery. Nice, very nice HTTP API. An interesting thing is that it also runs a DNS server. So for legacy applications that you can't change to use Consul's nice HTTP API, if you can set up the machines that they're running to use Consul as its DNS server and be able to resolve services via DNS. So they've thought about legacy and the ability to use DNS to connect to these other services. And there's a rich health check system built into this service registration and discovery. Just about anything you could think of that you wanted to check, you can do it. You can run whatever script on the system you wanted, and it would check it. If you all look at the documentation, it's pretty amazing what you can do with it. By default, since a lot of these applications we write are REST HTTP-based applications, they have the concept of an HTTP health check, and we automatically register the actuator health endpoint as an HTTP health check with Consul. They also have an event system that is built in that allows you to send kind of ephemeral event messages to these non-persistent messages to all of your instances. And I have built a bus implementation of that, which, as I was prepping for the demo, for some reason is broken. But that's okay because did anyone go to the Spring Cloud Stream talk? So you can see here it says it uses Spring integration. Well, Dave Sire last night finished rewriting the bus to use Stream, which is independent of the message broker, which is awesome. So now all I need to do is translate what I had written using Spring integration to have a Consul Spring Cloud Stream message broker. And then, so I won't be able to show the bus because it's broken right now. but I will get it working. But it's nice because now, if you can connect to localhost 8500, excuse me, you get all of these pieces served up by one system: configuration, service discovery, and the bus. They also have a nice ACL system that they are starting to integrate deeper and deeper into the system. So your configuration could be controlled by an ACL. Service registration is starting, so you have to be authorized to be able to register a service, for example, but they'll be extending that so that you must be authorized to be able to see the instances of registered services, for example. That's coming. Question? So why would you use consul versus Eureka? That is a good question. So one of them is, since consul is not JVM based and it runs as an agent, if your system is polyglot, this might be an option that you want to take advantage of because of the rich HTTP API. So that's one question. Excuse me. Got a little scratch in my throat. This is my third talk, so the legacy DNS support is another one. Thanks for leading me into my next slide, by the way. And being able, I like being able to just say, if I can reach my local agent, I get access to the system, and the agent is responsible for contacting the rest of the cluster. The behavior is different than Eureka, right? Eureka is built for this highly available infrastructure. Consul is geared a little more towards consistency. I think the ACL system in Consul is something that when Eureka was built, right, it was built for, you know, our walled garden inside. There's no one else. It's not multi-tenant. You know, when we added Eureka to, if anyone saw the Spring Cloud Services talk in this room the other day, you know, we had to, on top of Eureka, add some security for some of our customers who wanted, you know, didn't want other, even of their systems, to be able to see what's registered, for example. But you'll, in a future version of Consul, that will happen where you wouldn't, you know, not even authorized. So I think the ACL system is also a neat feature of Consul. Okay? All right, let's see it. Let me... Yeah, so John's pointing out that Netflix did create a sidecar, and we actually kind of said, I bet we could do something like that, and it took me about half an hour, and there's Spring Cloud Netflix sidecar. So polyglot isn't the only way to do it in Consul. It just is more first class in Consul than the sidecar, right? You'd have to run the Java sidecar for polyglot support for Eureka. So, but it is there. Just a different focus is all. Thanks for pointing that out. So let me turn off. I don't want to overload my laptop by the end with having all these systems running on it. So I'm going to start Consul up. And then, so I'm going to show you the UI to begin with. So this is one of the neat things about Consul. So it's up, it sees itself as one of the services that is registered. And it has just the cluster status available. You can see into the KeyValue Store that is available. A little while ago, I went ahead and added a few properties already. I will show you that, but super easy to come in and, you know, change values and edit things. It's really, really nice. Nice little UI. Has about the ACLs, which we've disabled because I haven't turned them on, and if there was another data center, it knows how to contact that as well. So really, really nice UI that comes with Consul. So now, let me show you the code here. I go ahead and stop these. So again, simple Spring Boot application with that enabled Discovery Client. And this application looks almost identical to the one I showed you in Zookeeper, right? I have the load balancer client. I also injected the Discovery Client here. So let me run a couple of these as well. If I come back to my app. Again, you can see it's using ribbon to cycle through just like before in Zookeeper. But now if you go to the UI, I shouldn't have closed that. You can see that I now have this service registered, the test console application. If I go to that, you can see I have 2 instances of it running, each with an HTTP health check running on it. So very nice. And you'll also notice if I go back to the services that I registered the Spring Boot management with this. So right now there's a limitation in Eureka 1 that only allows you to register 1 service per JVM, but Consul doesn't have that restriction, and Eureka 2 won't either. But you're able to register whatever ports that your application might be listening on, right? By default, usually it's just the HTTP port, but if you have you can run the Spring Boot management and actuator on a different port, right? Or if you spin up you can spin up your own internal, ports. If you had some TCP thing that you're doing, you can certainly register it with Consul as well. So very nice. And let's come back here, and I can show you the environment. So this is a nice demo because you can see the hierarchy of properties, right? So this test property is available to all applications. Yes?
A couple of questions. Will I be able to see the edits, the history that is in Zookeeper and Consul? And just, I can give a few more questions. Will the Zookeeper or Consul keep track of the configurations that it supplies to the clients? Will it have a reporting facility so that I can see where the conflicts come from? So kind of the resolving conflict that the clients get? Will it be reported back to the conflict server?
So these.
And last question, what about secrets? I mean, configurations which you shouldn't be able to see here, or?
Good questions. What was the first one?
History of edits.
History of edits.
Yeah.
So no.
Is there a history somewhere?
So
Who's done the edits then?
So one thing to point out, these are not using the configuration server, right? These are using a local client to connect. Instead of using our Spring Cloud config server, the local configuration clients go directly to these services. So we don't have Git or anything versioned like that. I'm not as familiar with Zookeeper. I know it keeps a version, but I don't know if it keeps the history of that particular.
There's a tool that does a sync from something like Git into Consul.
Yeah, I've seen that. So there are tools that do that, but by default, these applications don't have a history like Git does, which is why we picked Git for one of those things. The other, he mentioned encryption, right? Keys, that like. So we have that facility built into the config server to encrypt. So I have a pull request, and if I would have had enough time, I could have showed you, but another console, another HashiCorp product is called Vault. Its job is to store keys and secrets, and go figure, it has backends for Zookeeper, consul, and etcd. So that would be the direction I would go for storing secrets in those particular, in all three of those.
Maybe a question more. If I need to do atomic kind of updates to my config store, I need to edit two properties and they need to be synced when they are delivered to the client. These tools support that?
So we have one of the things that you can't leave, Mike. Bye. Former coworker, I can tease him. So you can, there's a couple things. One of the things is we have added a refresh actuator endpoint on with the bus that you could say, hey, refresh all of services of type X, and they would go back out and refresh their configuration. So you could go make the edits and then say, hey, go update. So that would be based on the properties of the particular server, right? So if they contact you, so there's, with Zookeeper and consul, there's not, they would get whatever is considered consistent for that system. Does that make sense?
I have two properties that I need to supply at in the same edit. The values are dependent.
I don't know if you can edit multiple properties at the same time in Zookeeper or consul, so I don't know if you can actually do that at the same time. You'd have to make two separate edits. Does that make sense? But those wouldn't reflect immediately if you write, because your clients wouldn't have that. The other thing so with consul and Zookeeper, unlike config server, we are, I think in Zookeeper we've added the ability to watch the repository and the client could automatically refresh.
Would it be true that that's only a race condition when you're starting a new service up and editing at the same time? If all the services are up and then you make a call in, you make a change to the two config values, the clients aren't looking at those values yet. Then you trigger a refresh, and that's where the
Well, his question was, I've updated one value and
another, but I won't have my clients use the values until both edits are done.
yeah.
Right, so don't start up a client while you're editing those.
Well, that depends on your platform, right? So anyway, yeah. So I hope it's clear as mud. Yeah.
This is dynamic config, right?
Yes.
That's the key difference there. It's not just a static bootstrap.
And I would have to investigate. I don't know if you can change two values at once in either of those systems in an atomic manner. I'm not sure. If you could, it wouldn't be a problem. So.
Do you know how the consistency model of Eureka will you have to work?
Eureka is where Zookeeper and consul lean towards consistency. Eureka leans towards availability, right? So it will give you stale data rather than not be consistent, where these are less likely to do that, okay? So that's one of the big differences between these systems, which is one of the reasons Netflix built it the way they did, because when they scale to tens of thousands of machines running, they'd rather have the data available even if it's old. They have multiple layers of protection. Say you get a stale server, right? One that doesn't even exist anymore, especially in AWS. With Ribbon, you have a layer of protection with retries. hystrix above that if, it will protect you and do a fallback if you fail again. So there are multiple layers to deal with that, specifically with that. So great question. Okay. I can't show you the bus because it's busted, but at least it happened before the demo and it wasn't live on stage. Any more questions about console before I move on? How are we doing with time? When does this session end? I guess whenever we want, because it's the last one. When's it supposed to end? It started at 2:15? Thank you. All right. Any more questions? Questions are great, even if I don't know the answers. So his question was, could you use config server that we had already released with service discovery from console? The answer is absolutely, right? So each one of these pieces that I've talked about is available via starter, and you can pick and choose. Now, like I said, I think that's one of console's strengths, is that it has all of these things, but you could certainly mix and match. Like I said, config server already has the encryption part built in. But like I said, I have a pull request for Vault that could be merged in before Brixton goes GA. So, yep. Any other questions? Let's see what we've got next. Okay. Anyone heard of etcd before? This is by CoreOS. They make an operating system that is built for containers. It's used heavily in their distributed system. Again, it's very similar to console, to Zookeeper. It's a distributed KeyValue Store. It's written in Go, has a nice little CLI. It has a nice HTTP API, has a ton of language bindings for it. This is an incubator project. So the GitHub repository is Spring Cloud Incubator with dashes in between each. Anyway, it's incubator. We'll decide, or maybe the community will decide whether they want us to release this and support this. So again, it's kind of repeating myself here, seems like, but Spring Cloud Config, etcd, uses their HTTP API. Again, look. Look at that. Hey, I get it. We're going to go edit this live. How's that? What was that? What? The question is, what am I using to do my slides? So it's a combination of things. The rendering of it, the JavaScript, and I use a open source product called reveal.js. My content is in Markdown, so very easy to write. What I'm using to watch, that made that go live by just me saving the file, this will end up on my personal website under the Prezos section, but is called Hugo, gohugo.io. It's a static site generator, and it will watch your source and refresh your page for you when it's done. So thanks for getting me. So config, very similar to console, very similar to etcd. We get the same kind of loading order, so you can have properties that are available to every application, some specific to your application or your application in a specific profile. And so this is one of the reasons that this is still an incubator project, is discovery. So lots of people use etcd for discovery, but there is no specific support for discovery in etcd. Right? With Zookeeper, I was able to use the curator recipe, and it made my life really, really easy to do it. You know, a few API calls and I was done. So whatever is here, I came up with. And it might not be ideal, so that's one of the reasons it's still an incubator project. So we use the HTTP API, and we set a node with a time to live that's configurable, but when that time to live expires, whoever's contacting etcd to find that, you know, an instance, that instance would be gone. So what I do is I set up a little background thread, and I just continually refresh that node, setting the API so that the TTL resets itself again. It's a pretty simple system, and it works. But that's probably one of the reasons why it's still in a... So if you're interested and want to learn, and maybe you could do something better than I could, this would be a place to do a pull request. We love pull requests, by the way. We love the community. That's one of the reasons I actually like working at Pivotal on the open source side, because my customers are you guys. It's pretty awesome. So let's see if I can get this working. So I have some convenient scripts in Spring Cloud Console and etcd to just start up after you have it installed, just to start it up for you. Where am I? Showing code. Unfortunately, this is going to look very similar to the last two sample applications that you got. In fact, if I were going to be really tricky, I could have written one sample application and used Maven profiles to bring in the right dependency, and the same sample application could work regardless of what was underlying because of Boot's auto configuration, right? I mean, I have copies of these applications in each repository, but it could have been one, and we just swap out the discovery, the starter, and it just uses the other one. So it's me being lazy, I guess, that I just copy. So again, right? This, I mean, could be the same application. I've just opened it up 3 different times. The properties are different, right? So well, we've got a little bit of time. So the things that we set up in the properties, and I've just been using all the defaults, are, you know, what path in this hierarchy should the configuration go? Where should the discovery go? What should I register as the IP address of this service or the host name? And should I use the IP address or the host name? What's that time to live that I talked about? How often should I go update that node, right? You don't want the refresh to be greater than the time to live. Anyway, so let's go ahead and, again, start me a couple of these. And I can show you here. It's not auto-completing for me. So I have a property already set up. I need to get that guy. Show you the value. So this little CLI is really nice to be able to just set values, get values. So we could also see what's in, what was the default there for that? I don't remember where it is. Spring Cloud Discovery. So here you can see that there is the directory, if you want to call it that, is the name of the application. And you see there are two values, one for each instance. Okay, and that's literally all I'm doing. I'm doing there. Let's see if. And I just put the host and port in there so that when the discovery client actually goes out to get those values, it has them to report back. So just I mean, this could be, you know, some complex JSON object with a lot more than host and port if we wanted, right? Just really, really simple for now. Oh. Same thing, Ribbon knows how to get through them. And we can go look at the environment, and here we have that same hierarchy, except it's from etcd. Okay? So let's see. What would it look like if I wanted to say, I want a different value for my property, right? So let's set. So instead of for every application, I want it to be for my application. So via here, right? So now let's, sorry, apologize for that. I can see it just fine. I don't know what's wrong with you guys. $8082. So refresh is one of the actuator endpoints that I mentioned before that Spring Cloud provides. Let's see if this worked. We should see a new value in this property source. And there we have it, right? So I updated my properties without restarting the server. Question?
Yeah. If I go down this dynamic configuration cloud, slide here, how will I know what time of day my application has which configuration? Now I have a fault in my application and I need to do some diagnostics, and I will come and see that there's no error here because the fault is correct, but when the error occurred, the fault was another value, and I mean, the ops guy is going to kill me because this is really just out of the blue.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the question is kind of back to that, you know, paper trail of who changed what value when, right?
Yeah, and when my application uses the properties, how do I know which properties that it's using? It's okay if everything's good, but if not, it's not very good. If it was real business data, we would have a traceability and audit and a history of events and configurations, and I would know. Yeah.
So in general with these, we don't really have a solution for that from the application side. It just gets the values from whatever source it does, right? With config server, you have a little better story, right, in because of the version control system that backs it.
Yeah, but the time will have its problem if it's dynamically updated. Unless the client knows how to keep track of which configurations that is.
Yeah.
One thing that we're doing is we're using that tool last time where we're taking our configuration and putting it in Gibb, and then we have a tool that just takes
Sure, but that's the
that log. Nobody's supposed to change it correctly.
well, what he's talking about is
Dynamic refresh.
well, is the opposite, the view from the client. Which versions of the data, which versions of the configuration do I have? And
Could you log that, like whenever the context refreshes, just have it log what the config values are, minus password and stuff?
well,
So you would add that to the
no, so one of the things that Actuator does is is if your keys end in password or key or something like that, it starts them out already. So we take care of that already.
What about triggering the case movements?
That does happen. We do trigger events when refreshes happen. So there's a potential that you could do something based on that event, right? But yeah, that's actually a good idea. I'd love to log an issue and have a discussion about that in general, because that particular, we don't have a solution for that in general, right? From the client side, what version of these things do I have? But
Hey, John. Does Netflix play these now? Yes. So there's a project in Netflix called Edda, which will help turn on the graph egress and other things for time. Is that integrated with the property service at all? I don't know.
so Netflix has a tool called Edda that does some logging of when things change in the environment to know that. So yeah, there could be something similar done specifically for configuration. So.
It's also worth mentioning that you should try to not modify critical properties on the fly, like make as much stuff into the application
Right.
as possible for immutable infrastructure. And
Yes.
properties are for things like retry count.
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah, John just making the point that, yeah, this stuff shouldn't be changed that often, and not by an operator at runtime, usually. So, yes, good points, and that's right. One of the things, even with config server, there's no security built into it, right? But you take Spring Security and you add whatever you need to. So, you shouldn't let just anyone do that. But you're right. That's a great point. So some other versions of Discovery that we have created. If anyone's heard of Lattice, this is our, the easiest way to call it is single tenant, dumbed down Cloud Foundry that you can run on your laptop. You can run it in AWS. And we built a simple version of Discovery that uses the receptor API from the Diego component of Cloud Foundry. So it's a read-only Discovery client, right? Registration happens at the platform level. When the platform creates a new instance of the service, it's immediately available to all the other services, okay? And we have some Spring Cloud connectors for some simple data services and messaging services in Lattice as well. There's another one I didn't mention. Josh Long also created a version for Cloud Foundry using the Cloud Foundry API. Very, very similar to this, except using the Cloud Foundry APIs, again, read-only. I know one of the developer advocates for Google wants to do a Discovery client for Kubernetes, I think. So would be similar to these using its API. So one of the new things coming in Brixton is it's called Spring Cloud Cluster. These are some concepts that distributed systems sometimes try and deal with that are not always easy to implement, but distributed locking and leader election. There are implementations of leader election with Zookeeper, and I have a pull request in for consul following their guide on their website, and a distributed lock using Redis. You could also do that with Zookeeper and with consul as well. This has reached milestone and will be available. This project actually came out of the work that they had done with, the guys had done with Spring XD, when XD in the original version had managed a container, and so it was started to be a platform, and so they needed to be able to say, to provide high availability, who's the master admin, and so this comes out of that work. I believe there's also an implementation of some of these patterns in Hazelcast that they did. Okay? I'm not going to demo that. Oh, look at that. I already listed all those. Great. You could do something similar. That's one of the things that people use etcd for locking. Oh, I'm going to show something else that isn't on my slides. How's that? So one of the things that was demoed last night in the keynote was they showed the Zipkin UI. So we have a new project called Spring Cloud Sleuth, not Sloth, Sleuth. What this is a, yes. There's nothing really exciting to see here yet. But so Spring Cloud Sleuth is our project to start to deal with distributed tracing. Some of the original code donated again by For Finance. They had a simple solution of putting they called it a correlation ID into the logs, so that every log statement had some ID that later on in Logstash or some other log aggregation system you could start to search and see things. And it's grown from there. We incorporated, we're trying to come up with a nice abstraction to incorporate other systems, including Zipkin. So Adrian, if you want to raise your, this is Adrian Cole, who has just started to work, how long has it been, 3 weeks? Something like that with the Spring Cloud open source team. He used to work at Twitter. He also used to work at Netflix, so he's got some great experience. He's coming to help us work on this distributed tracing problem and correlation. And he's one of the, I don't know, I call you one of the founders of the Open Zipkin organization. There's organizers. Yeah. So yeah, the project, he is not a founder of the project, just the open implementation of maintenance of Zipkin. So we're certainly happy to have him here with us. And so there's not a lot to see in this project, but what happens is that we start to instrument different places in the application to either start a trace, generate a trace ID and span IDs. So this is, a lot of these terminologies are based on the Dapper project from Google. They put out a white paper, and so it's really easy to use their terminology. But a span, a trace follows some particular pathway throughout your whole system, from the original client request to whatever downstream systems it talked to. And there are segments of that trace which are called spans. So we start to instrument different places in the code, either using the hooks that Spring provides, or in other places where there aren't hooks, we can use AOP to hook into those places where they're not hooks by default. But we start to propagate these IDs throughout the system so that they can be fed to some downstream system, and you can get this picture of what a particular request looked like. Yes, question?
When I have, traditional log statements between these entry points that you have now got the correlation ID baked into the log out message, will you also, how do I get the correlation into my ordinary log messages so I don't have to go down to all those? Are you able to bake that in also?
So whenever there is a change in thread, we try and propagate that context through the different threads. Particular problem we're having is with Hystrix right now, the circuit breaker, which runs things in a thread pool. But yes, that's what we try and do, is propagate those values across whatever boundary we encounter, whether that's a thread in the current JVM, it's an HTTP request to some other subsystem.
But my existing user log gate, say,
Sure.
will those log messages be able to get the correlation ID by adding a new format or printer or whatever?
Is it in the MVC?
In the,
MVC for
Yeah,
log container?
or do you get an implicit trace ID that you could?
yeah, let me show you. So let me start my little sample application. This one does even less than those other applications. Well, so, oh, it failed. I have to, yeah, so I'm running Zipkin, the components of Zipkin, which are a collector, a query service, and the web UI. So just 1 second. And it looks like we're good. My sample is specific to Zipkin, so it expected them to be up and running, but so you can see these beautiful colored logs, right? I have these empty values because I haven't made a request yet, right? So there's nothing to trace. But if I come hit my sample application, which did something just like my other app, it made a call to myself. So I'm going to have, I can show you the code. It's easier to show you than not. So when I hit slash, it got me a little random time just so that my trace looks interesting. And I just called myself, but a different endpoint of myself that I've implemented down here, and just returned the value. So just a little simple 2-stage call. If I come back to my run logs, you'll start to see trace IDs. So you can see that they all have the same trace ID, but the different span IDs, one for each section, right? One for the original request to slash, which you can actually see here in some of the values, right? So this particular one was to slash, where this one was to slash /2, okay? So you can start to see those, and if I look at how I added that, so this takes advantage of a new feature in Spring Boot 1.3, which allows you to specify the log pattern via properties. So this could go in configuration, it could, right, so it could be the same for everything you have. And we add just a simple value to the SLF for J. I don't even know what MDC stands for, but that's where you add it to the logging context and it will show up, right? So that was what was donated from For Finance, their implementation of that for us. Okay? So there it is in the, don't want the event log, in the logs.
Can I give him a $5 question now?
Yes, but wait, there's more. For just $5 more, you get a picture. So this is, those same values were shipped to Zipkin, which stored them in Redis, and then allows us to use this very clunky, ugly UI from Zipkin to look at the traces that were just done. So you can see I'm the only app. We'll go ahead and find the traces. You can see I tested this a couple hours ago, but here's the trace that we just did. And so you can see that the originating request to HTTP/ is here, and the subsequent request to HTTP2 is below it. And we give you can click in and see a little more details. And one of the things we're starting to do is to try and, that Adrian is organizing, is to try, regardless of implementation, there are companies all over the place trying to do similar types of things. And it would be really, really nice if there was some kind of community agreement on what those things looked like and how they were shaped, so that regardless of the actual implementation that you happen to be using, you can reason about them in a similar manner, right? So one of those are these attributes that you see here posted via HTTP. We also have some instrumentation for Spring integration. So if you send a message to a queue, we can show you some information about that message, for example, in these traces. So, and here I'm sampling everything. That's another term, is sampling. How often do you want this data to be captured? And we're saying 100% of the time, which you can see the amount of information for these two little calls, right? It's a lot. There could be a very high explosion of data. So you want to determine some way of sampling some percentage of your data, or turning it on for a particular user or a particular set of users, or when someone's having a problem. Anyway, so there's lots of strategies for when to actually capture this data versus all the time, which we're doing in these samples. So here first. Go ahead.
When the request comes into the router in Cloud Foundry, there is a recap request ID. Is that correlated with the span ID, or does that flow through?
So he's talking about a value that is created by the Cloud Foundry router, a request ID. There isn't support for that now, but the gentleman that's seated right in front of you, you need to have a conversation with. And we should, right? There should be, especially in Cloud Foundry, we should have some way to get, whether that's an attribute like I've showed these HTTP attributes. So you can search by these attributes. So you'd be able to search by that, whether that's the actual trace ID or not. You should be able to correlate between them if it's not, but we should definitely talk about it. In fact, the trace should probably start at the router, not when it hits the app. So that's another thing. So. Yes, so his question was, maybe at some point during my request, I'm splitting and it's not a single path through the system. There's multiple paths through the system, and how do we account for that? So your question was right. They will have the same trace ID, but different span IDs. This particular UI might not handle that situation perfectly, but we want to get to the point where however we display them would work like that. Because as soon as you start having messaging, right, that is no longer even synchronous, right? And we have some demos of that in the Spring Cloud Sleuth repo. There is a messaging sample. You can see some of that in action. So great question. Yeah, we definitely want that to be a first-class citizen in tracing.
Just some context, the UI, I've seen fixes for like 100 order of magnitude spans. So for example, when you get to like things like in out, middle up, and there's like a zoom feature where you can click and drag to figure out what it is. It's not beautiful. It doesn't get, if you start with this, it's
So you're just explaining that sometimes these spans in very large systems can reach 100 to 200 spans for one trace, and there are some facilities in the UI to kind of zoom in on little pieces of it, but yeah, they can get quite long. Yes?
You mentioned that there's sampling rate, because you don't want to store all this information from each. What if you want to store the entry in the log so you can do traces in something like Splunk or Kibana or something, but you don't necessarily, does the trace stop it from going to, the sampling stop it from going to the logs, or just stop it from publishing out to this repository? I don't think the log file is where the problem would be with too much information, but here would, and it might make sense to want to keep it in the log file but not here.
Absolutely. So the question was, could we have the tracing being put into the logs even though it's not being shipped off to some log collection place? And don't think we have support for that right this minute, but that's definitely seems like something that you might want to do, is always log, but sometimes ship to your trace collection system.
I'll give you one answer to that. I just joined Gibb. I worked at Twitter before we were the original creators of this project. And they use Scribe, which is a logging aggregation system. And what it turns out to be is like, you want to have tracing always on because it's a troubleshooting tool. Right. But you don't want to kill your entire infrastructure. And so what we had, there's at the time, there's still on the code base, the source inside of things, is a dynamics sampler which will throttle you to a certain storage rate. So it's normally the rate of writes that actually will kill everything. So the data size of that, I mean, it is a big deal, but so it would be throttled to a certain amount. So we would use like Zookeeper to store the aggregated storage rate that you want to optimize, and that would be towards that. But still, like for our front end, because it's Twitter, right, it would be like 1 billion requests simple. And it's very specific. Like if you're looking at a tool that's an internal one, like you might want to sample all things for multiple users, because all our employees that might want to sample. I think Netflix has some tools that actually have some smarter sampling, and that's an area that typically doesn't do real development as far as smart sampling. That's one of the things we're trying to do with the Spring Cloud work, is to make sampling a little bit more intelligent.
So for those of you who couldn't hear, he was describing how it's useful to always have sampling on, but at Twitter, where he came from, they throttled it by write rate as opposed to just a percentage of users or something like that, if I can sum up and make small. So awesome. Any more questions? I think, so I when this gets to my website, this link here in the middle, you'll be able to follow those links to some of the material out on the internet that I found trying to compare and contrast some of the discovery and configuration systems. Yeah, if anybody have any other questions, I think go ahead. So he's asking if there's any problem having different clock times, and if it's been a solved problem. Hopefully the ceiling's not going to fall on us. I would say there has been attempts to solve the problem. I don't think it's totally solved. One thing that is that each span keeps the local time of when it was sent and received, even versus the log file. So the spans have their timestamps associated with them. So you'd be able to get them relative to each other, right? So that's something we're looking at, right? Because especially when you get into the asynchronous tracing, right? Some message that got kicked off that doesn't fit well into timed, and so trying to come up with a strategy for relative time, not necessarily timestamp, right? This one happened before this one. So another concept that I didn't really mention was that of a parent span. So when you create a new span, so say you've kicked off to something else, one thing that happens is it says, oh, my parent is this guy. So there is a little bit of the relative when it happened, even if their timestamps overlapped, because you know that he was your parent, he would have to come after you, even if the timestamps weren't quite right. So there's been a little work into that, but it's not totally solved. More questions?
We did a distributed log system like this, and the exact is that we knew that there was a sending system, an initiator, and a receiving party, and they were always paired, so we would know which message was the response to another log message.
Right,
So
right.
pairing was always there.
Yeah.
A lot when you want to, system begins calling each other, around.
Yep.
And especially the timing as well.
Yeah.
So to add that would help a lot in also creating better UIs.
Yep.
So you can make a better tree and dig around like that. Yeah, so you actually finishes, collapses the call tree by the log method, so you know which calls actually went good and which went bad. Yes.
Cool. And, sure. Yeah. Yep, that's, yeah. Yep. So he's saying that you can, with config server, by default, you use config server to find discovery. Netflix, the default is the other way. You use discovery to find config server, and that feature is only specifically for config server is currently only available in Eureka. Yep. So go ahead and log an issue in, is it in console that you're using? Yeah, I'm not, I like I said, we'll have to, me? Yeah. Yep, it's me. Yeah, and there are a couple other things that aren't quite there. So Zool should work across all of these. Ribbon does. There was something that was missing that I know was missing besides that. So thanks for bringing that up. Oh, Turbine doesn't work with the other discovery systems yet. So, any other questions?
Maybe back to tracing, because there is also this library called Brave that's like a Scala-free,
Yep, so he's mentioning Brave, which is the library that we use to write to Zipkin in Spring Cloud Sleuth.
So because you and Adrian were saying that you are going to develop this new with samplers and all that, but what about Brave? You know, the library that is agnostic about the framework that you're using. Will it be developed as well? Are you thinking about that? Or is it just
Not sure Brave is agnostic to the framework you're using. So, yeah, it does have some core libraries. It's been migrated to OpenZipkin. So I can't, Chris, what's his name? The maintainer. Yeah. Yes, which is...
Yeah, so if you ever forget who to contact for what project, you can remember Gitter is
So yeah, if you want to chat with us, we're on Gitter at Spring Cloud, and OpenZipkin/Zipkin if you're... So...
Maybe I can pose another question. So my question is, if you're going to develop Brave, like the implementation that is like for everyone using Azure AVM, and use this in Spring Cloud 2, or rather just code the samplers and all that in Spring Cloud 2?
We don't know yet. Yeah.
depends, like there's annotations and things that would only make sense in Spring Boot or like Spring Cloud, there might be some code. But I mean, the funny thing about tracing libraries is that it's all instrumentation, right? There's always a binding layer where you're connecting things together. And some of the things that we want to make sure work are things like context propagation, right? So if you have a thread ID for your trace, you want that to pass into the system. That requires to use the same libraries or have some integration with it. So the goal is to make it easier, not harder.
Yeah, and with Spring Cloud Sleuth, our goal is to instrument Spring apps, to have that instrumentation happen regardless of what your downstream tracing solution happens to be, right? So we have Zipkin, we have the logs, but we could certainly, we want to play nice, and so we're trying to get that right, and Adrian's trying to drive the community from the open Zipkin side and just tracing in general with the community. They're having a summit, I don't know what it's called, workshop, a tracing workshop in San Francisco in October, something like that, where people from all over the community, from Twitter to SoundCloud to others are pivotal, of course, but are coming to talk about tracing in general.
And other things like, for example, in the Drupal update, more often like we use something called page trace. So one of the important things is just to bear in mind that there's rarely like one specific thing that everyone
Right.
everywhere uses. And so that's why we try to pull things into OpenZipkin in these workshops, is to at least get people to talk together. So for example, when Spencer showed up there, HTTP response code is like labeled differently in every one of these implementations, so you can't query it falsely and that
Right.
could be like false success or something. So we're at the stage of just trying to get everybody in the right room and try to make sure that things are aware of progress.
Yep, like if we can come to some community type standards regardless of the implementation, that will help reason about these things across implementation. So, well, I'm going to say I'm done. You can come ask me questions after I turn my mic off.